I have to tell you first that my father was not a soft man, and that the woman who became my mother was not a soft woman, and that everything good in my long life came out of the place where those two hard things finally leaned together. I was 11 the autumn the county started watching us. I know now what I only felt then, that a wagon would come up the sorrel bench road too slow, and a man in a clean coat would sit it a while looking at our fences and our roof, and at the three of us standing in the yard with our knees showing through our trousers, and then he would turn the team and go back down toward Tilden Crossing without ever once getting down to say good day. My father would watch him go with his jaw set like a gate latch, and then he would tell us to get back to our chores in a voice that had no give in it at all, and we would. People called my father Jonah Hale, the way you'd name a thing you'd as soon not touch. Behind it, when they thought we couldn't hear, they called him the convict, and worse. He had gone away for 4 years to the territorial work camps when I was small. I scarcely remembered him before it, and he had come home gray before his time, with a stillness in him like a man who has learned that talking only ever made things harder. The town had it that he'd half killed a man over money. The truth, which I did not learn entire until I was grown, was that the man who done it was my father's younger brother, and that my father had stood up in that courtroom and let the weight of it come down on his own shoulders so the boy wouldn't hang. He never said a word in his own defense. He never said a word about it after either. He just came home and found my mother 3 months in the ground, and his 3 children scattered out among neighbors who'd done their Christian duty and were plainly relieved to be shut of us. And he gathered us back up to that hard bench above the marrow and set about the business of keeping us alive. He kept us alive. I want that said plain. We were never hungry that I can recall, though I know now there were seasons he must have gone without, so we didn't. He worked that thin ranch from dark to dark, but a man can keep children fed and clothed and still not know the first thing about being a comfort to them, and my father did not know it, and I think the not knowing shamed him worse than the camps ever had. There was Junie, my sister, 9 that fall, who had quit speaking near a year and watched the world out of our mother's gray eyes. And there was Mose, the baby, 6, who had no memory of our mother at all and so had decided, with a 6-year-old's plain logic, that the lack of a mother was simply a thing that could be fixed if a person looked hard enough. He looked hard at every woman in Tilden Crossing. It mortified my father to no end. It was Mose, of course, who found Cora Fenn, or who decided on her. The two amount to about the same thing where Mose was concerned. Plum Hollow lay over the east shoulder of the bench, a fold of ground the rest of the country had passed over because it was too small and too shut in to graze cattle on. A woman lived there alone. That was the whole of what the town knew about her, and the whole of what the town held against her. A woman alone, on her own ground, asking nobody for anything. She kept bees and an orchard and a kitchen garden, and she came into Tilden twice a month with honey and dried apples and pears put up in syrup, and she sold them and bought what little she needed and went home, and she did not stay for the talking. The Ladies' Aid had decided some years back that she was proud, which is the word respectable people use for a woman who does not need them. By the autumn I'm telling you about she was, I suppose, somewhere past 30 and given up for a spinster, and she wore men's boots under her skirts because they were better in the mud, and the whole of Tilden Crossing had agreed she was a peculiar creature best left to herself. We had been told to keep off her land. Every child in the county had, so naturally that was where Mose went. He'd wandered after a runaway shoat down the east draw and over into the hollow, and the first any of us knew of it was Junie tugging my sleeve and pointing, gray-eyed and silent, the way she did. I went after them both at a dead run, certain we'd be horsewhipped for trespass, and I came up over the lip of that hollow into the strangest, sweetest piece of ground I had ever seen. Old apple trees gone half wild but heavy with fruit, white boxes of bees humming in the slant light, a tidy cabin with smoke standing straight up from the chimney. And there in the middle of it was Mose, sitting in the dirt eating a pear with both hands. And a tall plain woman in a man's coat standing over him with her arms folded. "This yours," she said to me, not unkind, just direct the way you'd ask about a strayed animal. "Yes, I'm awful sorry, we'll go." She looked at the three of us a long moment. I have thought about that look many times since. I believe she saw exactly what we were, the patched clothes, Junie's silence, the watchfulness that children get when they've learned the world is mostly waiting to find them wanting. She'd have had no cause to love us. We were Jonah Hale's brood, and she had to know the name same as everyone. "Boy's hungry," is all she said. "You all are, sit down." We sat. She brought out bread and butter and more pears, and a comb of honey on a chipped plate, and she let us eat without asking us a single question, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for us in a year, though I couldn't have told you so then. And when Mose, full to the eyes, climbed up unbidden into her lap and laid his head against her coat and went straight to sleep the way only a small, worn-out child can, she went very still. She did not push him off. She sat there in the late sun with my brother asleep against her, and a look on her face I did not understand at all, that I would not understand until I had children of my own. The look of a person discovering a door they had nailed shut a long time ago and had not known was only leaned to. When my father came over the hill an hour on, hunting us, he found that. His 3 children fed and easy in a stranger's orchard, and the youngest asleep in the lap of the woman the whole town said to leave be. I watched his face. He had come up ready to be ashamed of us, ready to apologize and haul us off, and he stopped at the edge of the trees and he could not seem to find any of the words he'd come with. Cora Fenn looked back at him steady over the top of Mose's head, neither one of them giving an inch. 2 people the town had agreed to throw away, taking the measure of each other for the first time. "They came over uninvited," he said finally, stiff. "It won't happen again." "It can happen again," she said, "if they like." And that was the whole of it. That was the start of everything. It happened again. Lord, how it happened again. It started with the honey. My father, who could not abide owing a soul, sent me over with a haunch of venison the next week to square the debt of the bread we'd eaten, and Cora took the venison and sent me back with a jar of honey, and word that now she owed us, and so it had to go on. I see now it was a courtship neither of them would have called by that name, conducted entirely through children and food and small stubborn favors, because they were each too marked and too proud to do it any other way. She started teaching Junie her letters. I don't know how it began. Junie didn't speak to ask, but Cora didn't seem to require speaking, and one day my sister came home with a slate and a piece of chalk and a page of careful letters, and the next month she came home having said 3 words to Cora Fenn out loud, the first words anyone had heard out of her since our mother died. My father, when I told him, went out to the barn and stayed there a long time. She doctored Mose's split foot when he stepped on a rake. She taught me to graft an apple branch, which is a thing I can do to this day, and while my hands were busy at it she'd ask me things, easy things, about the stock and the weather, never about the camps or our mother or any of the hurt places. And somewhere in those afternoons in the orchard I started, for the first time since I was small, to feel like a boy, and not like a small grim man holding up a corner of a falling down house. What I want you to understand is that she did not do these things to win my father. I'd stake my life on it. She did them because we were children who needed them, and she was a person who, once that nailed-shut door had come open, could no more leave a hurt child be than she could stop her bees from working. The town had her exactly backward. They called her cold. She was the warmest soul I ever knew. She'd only built a wall around it the way you'd build one around an orchard, to keep out the things that would strip it bare. And my father, my hard, silent father, began to find reasons to come along when I carried things over. He'd mend a hinge on her gate that didn't need mending. He'd split a winter's wood for her in an afternoon and refuse her thanks. He brought his rifle over and shot the bear that had been at her bees, and she fed him supper after, and the 2 of them sat at her table with us, children loud around them, and said almost nothing to each other and were, I see now, happier than either had been in years. It was Cora who said the thing out loud first. It would be. My father would have died of the wanting before he'd have risked the asking. It was a hard evening in the deep of that winter. Mose had taken a fever, the kind that came up fast and frightening in those days, that took children, and my father had ridden through a sleet storm to Plum Hollow because he did not know what else to do, because in some part of him he had already made her the person you go to when a child is dying. She came back with him through the dark, and she sat up the whole of 2 nights with my brother, sponging him cool and dripping willowbark tea between his lips and singing low when he thrashed. And on the gray morning the fever finally broke and Mose opened his eyes and asked, "Croaky, for breakfast?" I saw my father standing in the doorway of that sick room looking at Cora Finn asleep, sitting up in the chair with his son's hand still in hers. And I saw a man come the whole way apart and put himself back together different. She woke. They looked at each other across my sleeping brother in that gray light. "Jonah," she said, quiet, "I'm too old to keep coming over this hill every time one of these children needs a person who will stay." He didn't say anything. He never could at the start of a hard thing. "I'm not asking to be looked after," she said. "I've got my own ground and my own keep, and I'd thank you to remember it. I'd come for them, not to be carried, but I'd come," she drew a breath, "if you'd have me." And my father, who had not let himself be defended in a courtroom when his own neck was in it, who had carried 4 years and a dead wife and a town's contempt without once asking a living soul for help. My father crossed that room and got down on one knee by her chair like the ground had taken his legs, and put his rough head down against her hands and my brother's, and his shoulders shook, and he said, muffled, the only thing I ever heard him say that came the whole way up from the bottom of him. "I'm not a fit man, Cora. You know what I am. The whole county knows." "I know exactly what you are," she said, and she put her hand on the back of his bent head the way she'd put it on Mose's 100 times. "You're a man who stood up in a courtroom and took another man's punishment so a boy wouldn't hang, and never told a soul, and let them call you the worst thing they could think of rather than buy your good name with your brother's neck." Her voice did not waver. "I knew it the first month you were home. There's not 3 people in this country fit to shine your boots, Jonah Hale, and I am tired to death of watching them treat you like dirt." She lifted his face up by the chin, plain and fierce. "Now, will you marry me or not? I've apples to see to." I was 11. I did not understand the half of it, but I understood that something had come right in the world, and I went and woke Junie so she wouldn't miss it, and the 2 of us stood in the cold hall holding hands and watched our father say yes to the woman who had already, weeks before, become our mother in every way that the word means anything. It should have been the end of the hard part. It was not. Because down in Tilden Crossing, the county had finally decided what to do about Jonah Hale's children. The man in the clean coat came up the Sorrel Bench Road for the last time the week before Christmas, and this time he got down. His name was Delroy, and he was an agent of the county, and he had with him a paper from the court at Greer and the backing of the Ladies' Aid, headed by a Mrs. Threlkeld who had decided, in her Christian charity, that 3 children could not be properly raised on an isolated ranch by a convicted man, and ought rather to be taken in hand by the county and placed in respectable homes. He said it standing in our yard with his breath smoking, polite as a snake, while my father stood very still and very pale, and the 3 of us pressed in behind his legs. "There's no call for trouble, Mr. Hale," Delroy said. "It's the children's welfare. A man of your history, you must see how it looks. The county only wants what's best for them." I will tell you that I had never been so afraid in my life, and that I have rarely been so afraid since. I was old enough to know that respectable people, once they had decided a thing was for your own good, could not be argued out of it, and that they had the law and the courthouse and the church on their side, and that we had nothing but a marked man and a thin ranch, and a woman the town called peculiar. It was the hearing at Greer that I have come back to all my life. The county seat, the cold courtroom, the long benches full of people who had come to watch the convict lose his children, and ranged against us the whole weight of respectability, Mrs. Threlkeld in her good coat, Delray with his papers. 3 sworn statements about Jonah Hale's character and his crime and the unfitness of his home. My father had no lawyer. He couldn't have paid one. He stood up in his one good shirt and he tried, haltingly, to speak for himself, and the words came out of him stiff and wrong the way they always did, and I could see it going against us in every respectable face in that room. See them nodding to themselves, the convict. What did you expect? And then Cora Finn stood up. She had walked the whole 11 miles to Greer in her men's boots because she would not be beholden to anyone for a ride. She stood up in the back of that courtroom and she asked the judge plain might she say a word, and the judge, who was an old man and not, it turned out, a fool, said she might. She did not plead. That was the thing. She did not weep or beg or throw herself on the court's mercy. She stood there straight as a fence post and she laid the truth out flat, the way she laid everything out. She told them she owned the Plum Hollow place free and clear and had for 11 years, by her own labor, owing no man a cent. And she watched that land on them, watched them have to reckon with a woman who answered to nobody. She told them she was going to marry Jonah Hale, freely, with her eyes open, having known him 3 months and his children longer, and that any home those children came to would be hers as much as his and run as she saw fit. She told them about Junie, who had not spoken in a year and now read aloud from the book at night. She told them about Mose and the fever and the 2 nights, and asked Mrs. Threlkeld, civil as Sunday, where she had been those 2 nights, and where the county had been, and where any of these good people had been in the 4 years a marked man kept 3 orphan children fed and clothed and whole on a hard-scrabble bench with not one hand offered to help him do it. You let him carry it alone, she said to that whole respectable room, and her voice never rose and never shook. Every one of you. And now that there's a warm thing built up there out of nothing but that man's 2 hands, you've come to take it apart because the building of it offends your idea of who ought to be allowed nice things. She let that sit. I have lived alone a long while, Your Honor, because this town decided what I was and never troubled to ask. They've done the same to him, only crueler. I'd not have either of us judged by people who never once looked. She sat down. The judge was quiet a while. Then he did a thing I have never forgotten. He called Mose up. My baby brother, 6 years old, swallowed up in his too big coat, stood in front of that whole court, and the judge leaned down kind and asked him did he understand what was being decided. And Mose, who understood it better than any of us because he had decided it back in the autumn in an orchard with a pear in both hands, looked around that room full of clean-coated strangers who'd come to give him a respectable home. And he found the tall, plain woman in the men's boots at the back. And he lifted his arm and pointed straight at her, the way he'd pointed at every woman in Tilden crossing for a year, only this time it was final. This time he had found what he'd been looking for. That's my mama, he said. I already picked her, I pick her. You could hear the courtroom take its breath. The judge looked at Delroy's papers a long moment. Then he set them aside, and he said the county had not shown him an unfit home, that what it had shown him was a family the county had failed, and a man it had slandered, and that he'd not break apart the one good thing in the matter to satisfy anybody's notion of how charity ought to look. He dismissed it. He told my father to go home and marry that woman and raise those children, and he said, looking hard at Mrs. Threlkeld while he said it, that the court would take it very ill to hear of any further interference with the Hale family from any quarter. We walked out of that courthouse into the cold, bright noon, the 5 of us, and my father stopped at the top of the steps and could not go any farther for a minute. Just stood there with the wind in his gray hair and Mose up on his shoulder and Junie's hand in his and my hand in his other, and Cora a step off, straight-backed, not touching him, because she'd built her wall to last and it came down by inches, and on her own terms even then. He reached over and took her hand anyhow, right there on the courthouse steps in front of half the county, the marked man and the peculiar woman, holding hands in the wind. Cora, he said, let's go home. I've apples wintering over in the cellar, she said, which from her was the same as weeping for joy. and she let her hand stay in his, and we went. They married in the new year in our own front room, a justice and no church and no ladies' aid, and it was the plainest wedding and the warmest one I ever stood up at. There was no grand kiss, just my father's rough hand cupping her cheek a moment, just her leaning her forehead to his, two private people letting the world see one small tender thing and no more. Then there was honey cake, because of course there was, and Junie read the verse out loud in her found-again voice, and most fell asleep in Cora's lap before the cake was cut, in the very same place where he'd first claimed her back in the autumn light. My mother Cora ran that joined household exactly as she'd promised the court she would, by her own lights, owing no one, keeping her plumb hollow ground in her own name to the end of her days because she'd built it and it was hers, and she'd not melt herself down into anyone, not even a man she'd come to love past all sense. My father never once asked her to. I think loving a woman who needed no rescuing was the thing that finally let him set down the camps and the courtroom and the long shame, because she'd never wanted a great strong man to lean on. She'd wanted exactly the man he was, the one who'd take a wound silently to spare somebody weaker, and she'd seen him true when not another soul would. They had near 30 years. I watched my father go soft by inches under that woman's flat, fierce loving, watched him learn to laugh again, watched him learn the words he'd never had, until the gruff stone man of my childhood was someone my own children would not have recognized. An old fellow with apple-grafting hands who told stories by the fire, and could not be parted from his wife's company for the length of an afternoon without going to find her. Tilden Crossing came around, the way towns do, once a thing is settled and they can pretend they'd always meant it kindly. But my mother never did go in for the talking, not to her last day, and my father carried the marked name to his grave and never explained it to a one of them. They didn't need the town to come around. They'd had each other and they'd had us, the 3 children who'd known, the way children do, what the whole county couldn't see, that those 2 hard-used people were the best and warmest souls in all that country, and that they belonged together, and that the only thing wanting in the world was for somebody small enough to be honest to stand up and point and say so. I was the eldest. I should by rights have been the one. But it was Mose who found her, and Mose who picked her, sitting in the orchard dirt with a pear in both hands, deciding with a 6-year-old's plain certainty that the great lack of our lives was a thing that could be mended if a person only looked hard enough. He looked hard, he found her, and she turned out to be the whole of everything we'd been missing. I am an old man now myself, older than my father got to be, and I have buried them both up on the east shoulder of Sorrel Bench, where you can see down into Plum Hollow, and the old wild apple trees they never could bear to cut. I go up there in the autumn when the fruit comes on. And I think every time of that first afternoon, the light through the trees, the bees working, my silent sister beginning to smile, my baby brother asleep against the coat of the woman the whole world had thrown away, and my marked father stopping at the edge of it all with no words in his mouth, looking at the home he didn't yet know he was about to be let into at last. The county came up that road to take us apart. A 6-year-old took one look and put us together instead.